lecture by Professor Andrzeja Nowaka, a lecture that is organized by Diplomatic Academy together with Institute de Republika. So welcome all distinguished guests, Mr. Żegocki, Mr. Director Przyłębski, ambassadors, representatives of diplomatic missions. So welcome you here. I hope you will learn some new things here and find out more of a Polish perspective. So before we start and proceed with the lecture, I would like to give the floor to Minister Żegocki and to say a few words at the beginning.
President of the Constitutional Tribunal, Professor Przyłębski, Professor Andrzej Nowak, Excellencies, dear friends of Poland. It's a great honor to be here and to participate in this first lecture which will show us a Polish perspective into the history, and especially which will be connected to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth heritage, which is, I believe, very important, especially nowadays, when we want to understand better the situation around us. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for co-organizing this conference. Thank you.
Well, maybe a few words from me, Andrzej Przyłębski, the new director of the Institute de Republika. I'd like to thank Mr. Żegocki, my ex-colleague ambassador of Poland, for this idea, which I accepted immediately because I found it very important to equip ambassadors and diplomatic staff being in Poland with knowledge about Polish tradition, Polish republicanism, Polish democracy, and Polish attitudes to the human rights and so on. And I'd like to thank Professor Andrzej Nowak for accepting the invitation. I wanted that he will be opening this series of lectures, this seminars, because of the quality of his research, and I'm very happy that he's with us. We will probably have some 8 to 10 lectures, one monthly, and we hope you will join and you will come, maybe with other ambassadors in a month or two. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Piotr Kwieciński. I work currently in a Polish Foreign Service, and I was tasked with a rather strange task, which is to introduce Professor Nowak. Why is this also kind of strange task for me? Well, because Professor Nowak is a man of science, scientific scholar, a man of Polish academia, but also very active in the Polish public life. So, well known in Poland among that I really can't. It's very hard for me to imagine a person interested in Polish past, but also in Polish present, who wouldn't know. And I know, of course, that here in this very room are only people interested in Polish past and Polish present. So, but I was asked to introduce him. I would say maybe one thing before I give floor to our guests. But the area of Professor Nowak's scientific interests of his research is extremely wide. Wide. But I would stress that there are, in my opinion, two elements, two areas most important for professor. One of them is area connected with the notion of freedom. The concept of freedom as something very crucial to understand Polish people, to understand Polish culture, to understand Polish to a certain extent, distinguished Poland, makes a little bit different than other from other nations, even nations, even European nations. And the second area, and those two areas are very much interconnected. It's the history of precisely the theme of our current lecture. It is the impact of Russia, both old Russia, Tsarist Russia, and communist Russia, and today Russia, on Central and Eastern Europe, and on Poland. This impact, certain this impact, and this is, in my opinion, of Professor Nowak, something which contradicts this very notion, Polish notion of freedom. I'm not sure if I'm right, but now I think it's time for us to give the floor to our listening guest. Professor Nowak, floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to me to start this series, this prestigious series, in front of so many distinguished guests. I would like to start with apologies. First, I took wrong glasses, so I wouldn't be able to read my notes, but that's lucky for you, because I have something like 40 pages of my notes. The other part of my apologies may be even more serious, because I want to switch slightly the subject. I don't want to talk from the Polish perspective, but I want to reverse the perspective on Poland, trying to see its importance from the point of view of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Why Poland elevates him and his Russia so strongly. Maybe some of you do not realize the fact that Poland is an important point in his political and especially historical political horizon. But I will try to show you that this is the case, and why the case has not only historical meaning, but is very important and more obviously important in contemporary political landscape of this part of the continent. This is how I imagine my task today. So first, I would like to start with a question that seems to be important to many people, especially many diplomats all around the world. What motivates Russian foreign policy, Russian policy of aggression, if you will? Is it, as many specialists tended to say, simply a method of solving internal questions in Russia? Some of analysts like Karen Misha or Ben Judah suggested that this is one of the methods to rule a kind of specific plutocracy, kleptocracy, which is organized around Putin and by Putin. But in order to justify this old thesis, I would say, one would have to close his or her eyes on what is going now in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe. Actually, Russia loses very heavily economic resources, and these spooks, these kleptocrats around Putin are losing money as well. That's not beneficial to them by no means in terms of economy. That's obvious that these kind of interpretations of Russian foreign policy have been compromised by the last 12 months. The other suggestion went as follows, that Putin entered, not just this time, but several previous times as well, the path of foreign aggression to solve internal pressure that made him less popular internally. That, as an old adage of Tsarist minister in the beginning of the 20th century, Vyacheslav Lev, who organized Russo-Japanese War in 1904, said, "Malenkaya pobjedonosnaya vojna, little victorious war will solve our internal problems." Well, the war in Ukraine is neither little nor victorious, so it definitely do not solve completely, if not current, then at least future and near future problems of Vladimir Putin internal. So I think we have to dig deeper if we want to find a serious answer what motivates this policy. I reject outrightly any psychiatric concepts of simply one person being mentally disturbed, and this is the answer for all, so to speak, misadventures of world politics in the past 1 year. That's something which I don't want to discuss. What is really important from my perspective, and what I want to offer you as one of possible keys to understand this determination of Putin to enter this war, is a kind of double key. One side of that key is sharpened by personal background of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He's, as everybody knows here and not just here, member of a very specific profession, a very specific elite of stemming from KGB, from political police, of a totalitarian actually regime that existed in times of Brezhnev and Andropov. What he was trained as a member of that group for many years, as a member of the staff of that group, is to how to deceive people, how to eliminate physically enemies, and how to use any possible weakness in his enemy in order to move him out of Soviet or Russian way. The other element of the same, so to speak, specific experience of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is his personal fascination, passion for Asiatic martial arts. As he trained from his very young days, a kind of Soviet version of judo, sambo, Soviet style of judo, that exactly sharpens the same attitude he was taught at KGB schools. How to use weaknesses of your enemies. You don't have to be particularly strong yourself, but you have to know perfectly well how to use weaknesses of your neighbors, of your surrounding, to get your task done. But this is one side that I don't want to stay on that side. No. As I said at the beginning, my professional background is neither sambo nor any other big Asiatic martial arts. I prefer rather football. My profession is history. That's why I want to focus your attention on this particular side of motivation of Putin's, but not also his, also contemporary Russian elite, and even more Russian elite. Many centuries long tradition of Russian statehood and culture, tendency to treat this direction towards Ukraine, towards Poland, towards Central Europe, but via these countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, all these countries that formed for many centuries, actually more than 4 centuries, a united Commonwealth of nations, Commonwealth united by civic freedom of its elite, of nobility. So why Putin and Russia treats that way and that particular neighbor or a group of neighbors so I would say nervously? One reason is very simple. due to geopolitics, you don't have to learn history. It is enough to look at the map. This is the only way to the center of Europe. To Europe, as some of our German or French colleagues tend to identify their countries with Europe itself, wrongly, because they do not form Europe by themselves. Europe is bigger. But also from Russian point of view, the real Europe begins with Germany, with France, or Germany plus France. That's why for Russia to reach Europe, both in, so to speak, positive way, to reach Europe as a model, as the Enlightenment model from the times of Peter the Great, but also as the goal of expansion, as the goal of control, something that is less frequently observed in Paris or in Germany, or in other the Southern European capitals, where they tended to look for centuries, at least, for Russia as a kind of barbaric, northern, despotic country, which cannot form a real danger for civilized centers of European powers. But from the Russian point of view, this Europe, real Europe, so to speak, that begins with Germany, is treated not just as a model from the times of Peter the First, Peter the Great, but also as the final and decisive prey, object of control. And today, this particular way of thinking is even more important for Russia and practically more achievable than ever before. Why? Because Europe is as big as it never been before. That's the simple answer. Remind judo, jiu-jitsu, and sambo. It is not your own strength. This is the weakness of your enemy that makes you strong. That's the Russian perspective. When you look at the map, you can see also that to the east and to the south of Russia, you have not only now many times stronger economies than Russia, for example, China, but you have so many times more numerous people that it is impossible for Russia either to expand south or east or to control south or east. I would like to remind you that in times of Afghanistan invasion by Brezhnev, Soviet Union counted something like almost 300 million people. In Afghanistan, there was at that time 25 million people living. Now in Russia, there are 140 million people living. And in Afghanistan, I don't know exactly because it grows very quickly, it's around 40 million. So you can see the change. In Pakistan, there are twice as many people now than in Russia. And I'm not speaking about India or China. So that makes any direction, any drive for expansionism to the south or east absolutely blocked forever, I would say. So the only way for Russia to sustain its ambitions as a superpower is to take strength from the direction where economic resources are still vast, but where political will and demographic situation is much weaker than it used to be and than it is in other directions. But there is one more aspect that should be taken into consideration, looking at the map and the history at the same time. This Russian drive to west, that is to the direction of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, stems from not just geography, but also history, and I would say ethno-linguistic history. Belarus and Ukraine belong, as you know probably, or Belarusian and Ukrainian language belong to the same group of languages as Russian. That is Eastern Slavic group of languages. They are different, but they belong to the same group, like German and English belong to the same group of languages. So that particular proximity, linguistical proximity. And something else, even more important, the fact that the statehood beginnings of Eastern Slavs are common. They began their statehood in the 9th century, organized by invaders from the north, from Scandinavia. That's where from the very name of Russia comes from, Rus, Rutenia. Rus, that was the name, meaning probably something like red hair, of that tribe from Scandinavia that conquered these Eastern Slavic tribes and organized the first statehood known as Rus Kagana, or Rus. That particular statehood, initiated in 9th century, is something like a common heritage for three nations now: Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. However, very quickly, already in the 10th century, absolutely the most important center of that statehood was formed in Kiev. That is on the Dnieper River, going to the south to the Black Sea, through the very important trade route between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. So that capital position of Kiev makes that particular city very important historically, symbolically, and makes it a kind of a bone of contention between those who are hosts of that territory, Ukrainians, and that particular group that would form its own statehood many centuries later, that is by Russia, because Russia revolves around Moscow. Moscow was founded in 1187, that is in the end of 12th century, something like 4 centuries after Kiev. So simply Moscow as the center of statehood that would grow into Russia is much younger than this Kievian Rus, as these beginnings are known. The main hero, historical hero of that time, was Vladimir the Great, the prince of that Kievian Rus, who baptized himself in the faith of Christianity in its Byzantine version. This is understood, as probably all of you know, as the beginning of something like a cultural unity of this original Rus with the Christian world, but also with Eastern variant of European culture. This particular name is important also because it is Christian name of our hero, or maybe that's not a proper name, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. This is after Vladimir, not only Vladimir Lenin, but also the first Vladimir the Saint, which is patron of Vladimir Putin. And how important it is for Putin, you may imagine when you visit Moscow, the Kremlin, and just at the side of Kremlin wall, you could see huge monument to Vladimir the Great, raised in 2016, that is just 7 years ago, in order to counter already existing, much older, monument to the same Vladimir, the baptizer of Kievian Rus, that was raised in Kiev on the Dnieper River in the middle of 19th century. Putin simply suggested by raising that monument that Vladimir belongs to us, not to Ukrainians. He should be taken once again into unity with Moscow. Moscow should be the unifier of Ukrainians, Belarusians, something that in the 19th century imperial nationalism of Russia was known as triune nation, led by Russians with younger brethren, that is little Russians, as they tended to call Ukrainians, and Belarusians. So this concept is very strong. And why I developed so long about this concept? Because it had also a very practical meaning. something that somehow evades the attention of contemporary analysts. This is not only about symbols, about monuments, about historical meaning. This is about people. This is about demographic. Russia, as probably all of you know, had a very dire demographic situation. By the way, just like Poland, this is not unique in Russia. But if you have imperial ambition, if you want to be superpower, you cannot sustain this position with such a dramatic demographic position or, situation as it developed in Russia in the past 30 years. So that's why Russia desperately needs, for its imperial ambitions, to have more men and women, people simply, to strengthen capabilities of Russia versus Asiatic, at least, neighbors. So for Putin, the most important practical idea coined to link these historical and demographic issues was so-called Ruski Mir. The concept was launched in 2007, officially because it existed earlier. It had existed earlier, but it was officially, so to speak, proclaimed as the goal of Russia to unite all Eastern Slavic people that were simply suggested to learn Russian, to be Russian, finally, around its center in Moscow. That's, I would call it, medium-range imperial project. To embrace Ukrainians and Belarusians, but also half of Kazakhstan, where something like 40% of the population were Russian settlers, or I would use another word, Russian colonizers, that were sent there by Tsarist regime in the 18th and 19th century during occupation of these territories by Tsarist imperial policy. So this kind of concept, Ruski Mir, is not just a kind of ideological fantasy. It's a very practical idea, medium-range idea, I would say, to solve at least some of demographic and geostrategic problems of Russia in the 21st century. That's why Ukraine and Belarus are crucial for Putin, not just for Putin, for Russia. Of course, there are many other aspects which I don't want to touch because connected with the importance of Ukraine and Belarus for contemporary Russians. I'm going to say a few words how this links Russian political, geopolitical plans and ideological projects to Polish history. That block of Eastern Slavs that is based on linguistical proximity and this imagined original Rus that was treated and actually is treated by Russians as a kind of cradle of Russia and cradle of great Russian state that should unite also or retake Ukraine and Belarus. To the west of these two countries, two nations that now exist between Poland and Russia, there existed since 10th century, slightly later than this Kievan Rus, developed Polish statehood that linked with Western type of Christianity, with Rome rather than Byzantium. Through that link with Rome, Poland would share through 10 centuries all adventures and misadventures of European or Western European or Latin, whatever word you would like to use, civilizational history. What makes this particular experience important is the fact that Poland, till 13th century, 14th century, developed its own version of, I would say, civic tradition of Roman law and its nobiliary elite that was very numerous, up to 10% of the whole population, achieved something like unique liberty or civic freedom in comparison even with other Western European countries. And this particular culture of numerous elite, nobiliary elite freedom would bring closer to Poland elites, so-called boyar elites, that is nobiliary elites, exactly from these territories of Bielorussia and Ukraine that, so to speak, relieved their historical fate after 2.5 centuries of being under occupation of Mongol invaders that came there in the beginning of 13th century. That's another story, and I don't want to dwell upon this. So, a kind of intermediary between this, I would say, Commonwealth, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth unity with territories of Bielorussia and Ukraine, was Lithuanian Grand Duchy that developed very effectively in 14th century, covering all the territories of contemporary, that is 21st century Bielorussia and Ukraine, under Lithuanian dukes, Grand Dukes rule. Through the union between, marriage between Grand Duke of Lithuania and Queen, who was titled King, actually, of Poland, Hedwig. This union was formed, Polish-Lithuanian Union, and would cover all these territories of Ukraine and Belarus. The symbol of the influences going through Poland, through university, which I had a privilege to being one of professors, Jagiellonian University, that was established in 14th century. And it played a very important role in this, I would say, streaming of civilizational influences going via Poland. The symbols that could make my long story very short could be spotted in Kiev and in Minsk. In Kiev, it is monument to Magdeburg law. Magdeburg law was simply medieval German, I would say, invention or reinvention of old Roman tradition of, I would say, self-government. City self-government, that's the essence of Magdeburg law. That people in the city can govern themselves, organize a council, Bürgermeister, and so on and so forth. We are free in our own city. That's the essence of Magdeburg law. And this Magdeburg law was, so to speak, implemented in Poland I would say, via cultural osmosis with Germany, cultural economic osmosis in 12th and 13th century. And through Poland, it would go to exactly territories of contemporary Ukraine, cities of contemporary Ukraine and Belarus. So in the beginning of the 19th century, people in Kiev wanted to raise that monument and were allowed by uniquely liberal Tsar Alexander to raise that monument in the beginning of 19th century, testifying that Kiev wants to celebrate its own liberty. Something as opposed to the very essence of Moscow tradition that is really based on autocracy. Not, if you don't want to use offending terms of despotism. Autocracy is something that every Russian would accept as the name of Russian political traditions. So, monument of Magdeburg law, which is still in Kiev, close to the Dnieper River, is a quite unique monument, or used to be unique, until in the 90s, right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the 90s in the 20th century, Minsk, the capital of Belarusian state, wanted to have the same model or the same symbol of Magdeburg law and raised also monument to Magdeburg law in Minsk, because both of these cities, via Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, accepted Magdeburg law in the end of 15th and the beginning of 16th century. That's something like a symbol of these influences going through Poland to this territory. There is no time to discuss problems and vagaries. Of course, if you have questions, I will be happy to answer. Of this cohabitation of different nations, different cultures within the Commonwealth. But the fact of influences going both ways, actually, from Ukrainian or Belarusian side to Polish side as well, predominantly from that Western side. They changed this Eastern Slavic group of people and make them less and less like Muscovy, like the state that was organized in that time around such personages as Ivan the Terrible, being the symbol of Moscow statehood in the end of 16th century. So this contrast between autocratic imperial regime constructed around Moscow and Commonwealth, which sometimes was accused, not always without some reason, for being too anarchical, but definitely on the very opposite pole to autocracy. This is contrast as strong and as obvious as probably no other in European neighborhoods, so to speak. And this made boundary between Commonwealth and Moscow not just boundary of different denominations. Eastern Orthodox existed on both sides of the boundary, but it was a kind of political culture or two political civilizational types organized on two different sides of that boundary. And these influences, lasting for several centuries, were finally destroyed to a degree on political, so to speak, ground by effective aggression of Moscow statehood throughout 17th and 18th century, ending the existence of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by the partitions of the huge body that covered almost 1 million square kilometers, almost territory of contemporary Spain and France taken together. So this huge state was destroyed by military political aggression of, so to speak, better adapted for that kind of aggression Moscow than Russian statehood, which found partners for the destruction of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the west. In Prussia, also very aggressive power in 18th century under Frederick II, Frederick the Great, and in Austria, Habsburg Empire. However, it was Russia that took the lion's share of the pre-partition Poland-Lithuania. After Napoleonic War, the percentage that can make you think about the role of Russia in liquidating Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the percentage of the share of that pre-partition Poland-Lithuania was as follows. Russia had 82%, Austria 11%, and Prussia 7%. So that's obvious who took the greatest share of that huge territory. And of course, a series of uprisings were not just ethnic Poles took part to regain their independence, their freedom, their own way, but also Lithuanians very strongly. That's why Lithuanians celebrate the same uprisings as Poles do, so-called November Uprising 1830, and even more strongly January Uprising 1863. But also Ukrainians and Belarusians celebrate the same occasions, of course. I mean, these or those Belarusians that are not united with President Lukashenko because he is not so happy about these remembrances of fighting against Russian imperialism. Nevertheless, this, so to speak, liberty-minded Belarusians and Ukrainians tended to celebrate these common uprisings against Imperial Russia in the 19th century fervently as Poles did. What makes, and I am going towards the end of my introduction to a discussion, because I hope that we'll be able to discuss many other also aspects of that story in a free exchange of your opinions or your queries, my guests, so to speak. To end this introduction, I would like to say why this history of Russian aggression towards Poland, liquidation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then Soviet next chapter of that imperial story centered geopolitically in the same place, in Moscow, in the 20th century. That was incomparably more cruel, more despotic, and more inhumane than anything the former regime, Tsarist regime, invented. And it killed dozens of millions, not just of Russians, which is well remembered, a kind of image of Russia as seen by Anna Akhmatova poems Requiem, as if only Russians were killed by Stalin. It was vice versa. The main goal of massive operations of killing people under Stalin were especially ethnic minorities, starting with Ukrainians, Holodomor, but also maybe you don't know that particular number, but during the so-called Great Terror, when according to official NKVD, that is political police of the Soviet Union, data, 679,000 people were shot during 2 years, 1937 and 1938. Most of people think this was old guard of Leninist party. Maybe poor Russians were shot. No, the main operation during the Great Terror was so-called national series of operations, where almost 300,000 from these 679,000 were shot. And the greatest among all these operations was so-called Polish operation. These are official data of NKVD. In one single Polish operation, 111,000 people were shot during these 2 years. And what makes this particular operation so unique is the fact that in that time, Poles in Russia, in the Soviet Union, sorry, numbered 700,000. So one per every 7 people, or 6 even people in Soviet Union in 1937, 1938, that had misfortune to be of Polish origin was shot. That was something like 40 times more frequently than average Russia during the Great Terror. That shows something, that nationality mattered for Stalin. He was not only a class-centered communist leader, of course he was to a degree, but he was also cold-blooded leader of a geopolitical unity known in previous centuries as Russian Empire. And under his rule, it was known as Soviet Empire. But he could express that Russia is at the center of this both cultural and geopolitical meaning of that empire. So enemies of Russia should be eliminated, should be liquidated. So this kind of series of operations, and much better known operation that killed 25,700 people in 1940 after Soviet aggression made in collusion with Hitler in 1939, are something that weighs heavily on the image of Russia that Putin wants to project. Where? Maybe not that much to Western Europe, but especially to territories that are known now as Global South. Because Russia tries from at least 19th century, at least in some part of its ideological development, some parts that are best represented now, or well, worst represented, if you will, by so-called Eurasianist ideology. Russia wants to identify itself as anti-West, as a kind of anti-Western power that defends the rest against the West from Western colonialism, from Western aggression, from Western domination. But in order to project such an image of Russia to Africa, to Asia, to Southern America, where Russia, as all of us know, is very successful in projecting that image. Something that makes that image less, I would say, persuasive is exactly Russian own experience as colonial state, as imperial aggressive state that exceeded anything America or France or England did, at least in the 20th century. I'm not saying about previous centuries. So exactly, Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, this infamous pact that linked Soviet Russia, Moscow, with Berlin, with Nazi Berlin, is something that Putin wants to erase absolutely with all legal and police methods from Russian memory, but also to counter memory of that infamous role of Russia, Soviet Russia, just like partitions of Poland. And other examples, I am concentrating my lecture on Poland, but there are other victims of Russian imperialism, Moldova, not just Ukraine and Poland, or Lithuania or Belarus, but also Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and all Central Asiatic that is republics during the Soviet times and previously territories conquered by Russian Tsarist regime. All these countries had their own history of Russian imperialism, of Russian colonialism. And Putin wants to eliminate that from any historical narrative because it counters something very important as ideological tool of Putin in contemporary war of images, where Putin wants to present Russia as a benevolent defender of all oppressed people in the world against dominating Western power, that is America, against Europe. But finally, there is one more, and the last one, which I want to describe, element in this Polish-Russian history that plays an important role in contemporary troubles of Russia to present itself as a viable partner, not just to, let's say, African countries or Asiatic countries, but to Germany, France, but especially to anyone with open eyes and open ears to reality. This is the concept of imperial zones of influence. John Mearsheimer, the American political scientist continuing the old school of Henry Kissinger, tends to present exactly that scheme of reasoning. There exist only great empires on the map of the globe, and only their interest is important. Lesser countries have no say in their future, in their contemporary issues, should simply stay low and accept the verdicts of great empires, because otherwise chaos would rule over the world. So this is exactly the concept that Russia wants to propose in such texts as, for example, text of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, the longest text he published, the real lessons of the 75th anniversary of World War II, text published in the national interest in the year 2020, yes, in June 2020, where he suggested that Western powers, especially Germany, France, but also to a degree maybe some realists in the States, in the United States, should accept that logic or re-accept that logic of imperial agreement, because the alternative is chaos. And that's why Ukraine should belong to Russia. That's why Eastern Europe should be a kind of an object of a deal between Western powers and that is Germany, France, maybe the States, and Russia as a proper, so to speak, proper host of that geopolitical space in Eastern Europe. And what is problematic about that particular vision is the fact that it had a symbol, and this, or actually two different symbols: Munich Agreement, 1938, and Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. They were two symbols of sharing zones of influence, of dividing. For Poland, of course, partitions of Poland in the 18th century are yet another symbol. For many other countries from our so to speak, place in the globe. This is also Yalta Agreement from 1945, which also for us symbolized a kind of sharing our fate without asking us, that is Poles, but also Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, of course Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, that were all given, or the fact was at least silently accepted by Churchill and Roosevelt, that they are given to Stalin. So this kind of historical perspective make this offer still brought to the table by Putin to Berlin, to Paris, and to a degree to so-called realists in Washington, D.C. as well, less persuasive or more problematic, especially when we link that memory with the most aggressive example of that kind of zone sharing, Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And Poland, together with Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, but also Romania and Finland, were all victims of that particular deal done by empires that wanted to reorganize peace in order to provide stability. So this kind of connection between Polish historical experiences and Polish historical role as a kind of black hole in which many imperial designs of Russia, Tsarist Russia, and then Soviet Russia, and I mean, for example, the importance of Polish solidarity movement, Polish Pope John Paul II, as a kind of igniting point for a crisis in the Soviet Empire, as much as the role of Poland as the leader of, I would say, national movements that led to collapse of the Tsarist regime in the beginning of the 20th century. So this kind of specter of Poland, specter of Eastern Europe, regenerating its particular place in history that is neither imperial nor colonial, is something that makes something like let's say memento to Russian imperial designs as are represented. Maybe at this point I should stop and introduce you for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I must say it was extremely interesting lecture, and of course I would like to ask many questions, but unfortunately I know that I have no time for it. So I will just start one or two, and then I will ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to take part in your questions, maybe remarks too. But I will start with something connected with the last, let's say, part of your speech. I mean the attitude, the Russian, Putinist, but I don't think only Putinist, attitude towards Poland. because you have stressed quite correct that they consider Poland an obstacle in their imperialistic imperialistic plans. And of course, they know that Poland was a victim to in the past. They would like to, let's say, and it is more or less the way they treat Poland. However, it is a little bit more complicated because on the other hand, they keep on repeating the narrative that Poland in a short time will take the territory of Western Ukraine for itself. This is, and it strikes me how often they repeat it, and not these are the Boyan course, this journalists from the media sector, but also important people. For instance, Sergei Naryshkin, who is the head of foreign intelligence of Russian Federation, he repeated it himself, something like that. So my question is like this: what is this? Is it only a pure fiction, and they know it's fiction? Because we know, of course, that this is pure fiction. Do they know it? Or maybe somehow they believe in it. And if they do believe in it, so why?
Thank you for the question. It seems to me that it's neither a matter of belief nor fiction construct. It is a method. It is a method of realizing Russian foreign policy. And it does not apply exclusively to Poland. And that's why it's interesting. Because it operates as follows. In circles, so to speak. The closest circle is exactly Ruski Mir, that it's Ukraine and Belarusia should for 100% belong to us, Russia. That's how they perceive it. Ukraine and Belarusia is ours. However, seeing the troubles with taking all Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine, where national identity, Russian identity is strongest, they try to solve this problem by exactly using this kind of suggestion that maybe we can share this trouble with Poland. The next circle that could be treated temporarily as a kind of partner, but Russia has no partners at all. But Russia suggests, for example, to the former Polish Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski and Prime Minister Tusk during Bucharest summit, it was 15 years ago, that maybe we can share, Putin said, maybe we can share Ukraine, you take the Western Ukraine, we can take the rest. That was, of course, a method of dividing Polish internal policy, because it was obvious that Polish president at that time, that is Lech Kaczynski, would absolutely and outrightly condemn even listening to such suggestions. But more interesting from a contemporary point of view is simply to see that offer as a kind of a constant method, because there are some circles in Poland, very narrow, very extremist, maybe 1 or 2%, that can think in these categories. Maybe we should take the book that belonged to Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for centuries. So, in strengthening that voice, or coining that kind of offer of temptation, Russia wants to have a proof on Polish side. For Ukrainians, you see, Poles want to occupy you. the real danger, not us, Russia. But Russia actually repeats exactly the same scenario in the next circle. That is when Russia offers in these conditions, contemporary conditions, a kind of sharing zones concept to Germany. Well, Ukraine is ours, that's obvious, Russia. But maybe we can share influences in Poland. Poland is, of course, no partner for Russia, for nobody in Russia, in terms of politics. Poland is only an obstacle that should be somehow eliminated, tricked to go away from the way of expansion of Russia. So the next partner or pseudo-partner for Russia is Germany. Historically, Germany belonged to that kind of partnership in 18th, 19th, and 20th century in the form of Frederick II, Bismarck, and Hitler. Very different forms of Russia, sorry, of German imperialism that really took part in partitions of Poland. But whoever dreams about repeating that scenario in Germany, because there are some extremists in, for example, alternative für Deutschland, that dream about that project, that scenario. Forget about something else, that Russia repeats that technique, that method once again, saying to Americans, you see, those Germans rebel against you. Finally, we can share the world with you, with America, because there are two Romes necessary. Eastern Rome and Western Rome. You could be the Western Rome. If you want to eliminate the troubles with Germans, you can deal with us. And even though in Germany, most of these, I would say, old-fashioned imperialists, I don't know how numerous they are, but they exist, think that Russia is an ideal partner for them. Forget exactly about that method of Russia that goes further than Germany. That Germany could also be used as a pawn in a Russian imperial game. That's why I think it's worth considering that particular method.
Thank you very much. You have somehow mentioned a phenomenon which is very interesting one. I mean, you said that they need a second Rome. So there should be two Romes, Western and Eastern. However, in the last, let's say, months or year, we have a, let's say, new phenomenon in Russia. I connected with Russian authorities, which is the phenomenon of a historical pivot, historical return from Peter the Great, which is a shift, which should be a shift from Europe, from the West. We don't want to mix anymore because of various reasons, towards East, towards Western Asia or Europe, as you name the name of this let's say, philosophical school. They are really doing it. I mean, for instance, I think 2 weeks ago, it was very interesting. In fact, students of a certain polytechnical institute in Moscow, connected very much to the military industrial complex, started to protest because they were the authorities started to force them to learn Chinese instead of Western language. And in fact, it happened. So, do you think this shift toward the east, this coming back from Peter the Great, is something which can really happen in Russia, or it is to a certain extent to only the narrative, this narrative of Russian propaganda?
Actually, it's good to read also, besides the Kalendarisha or Benjuda Pomerance's book about Russia, that there is no truth in which people believe in Russia, not just Putin, but ordinary people believe in Russia. That many absolutely contradictory narratives can work together. There is no, as famous Russian philosopher from the beginning of the 20th century, Simeon Franz, there is no logical conscience in Russia. So you can use absolutely contradictory methods, ideologies. You can appeal to communists, and you can appeal to extreme fundamental Christians at the same time, suggesting that Russia is the center of your hope, of the future of communism or the future of left-wing traditions stemming from Soviet times. And at the same time, Putin is a catechon, the last defender of Christianity. This kind of absurd concepts are linked together and emanated by the same ideologues. So that's something that should be taken into consideration. And now, going back to answering your question, maybe the last question, and we'll give the floor to other participants. I wanted to say that tendency to Eurasianism, to value more strongly this Asiatic or non-European part of Russian identity is an obvious answer to troubles with the West and a means to blackmail the West. That's how, for example, Putin organizes all these manifestations of his fraternity, but Russia is now a younger fraternity term should be used, with China or with India, or whenever Putin or his ideologues use the vision of Russia as the defender of global South from the domination of the West, America and Europe. It always wants to use this global South as a pawn in its own imperial game, to regain position versus the West. Because finally, I think that for the most of Russian elites now, Europe or the West is still much more important than China in cultural terms, in, I would say, identity, self-perception. I would say that it is obvious that Russian billionaires prefer to spend the rest of their life in camp and not in Canton.
Well, so thank you very much. And as I stated before, now it's time for you to ask questions to Professor Nowak, or maybe to your remarks on the items. So please feel free.
Open to encourage all of you with a small question. You mentioned in your lecture the influence of Scandinavian, of the Vikings, but you mentioned only very shortly the influence of so I forgot. Mongolian. Could you say something more about, because in probably the mentality of Russians, the brutality of Russians is inscribed to the Mongolian influence.
I think that's a very risky subject. By the way, the word that symbolizes the political system in Russia, that is a specific whip, stems from Scandinavia, not from Mongolia. Of course, there are other words in Russian language and in Slavic languages through Russia that stem from Mongolian 2.5 century long occupation, like Dibi, that is a kind of chains, or Opawa, that is political troubles, or Kandały, that is Kajdany in Polish chains. All these terms stem from Mongolia. But this does not mean, according to my interpretation, that Mongolian Empire taught future Russian, I should say, future Russian, because there was no Russia, future Russian territories and tribes only grew. No, Mongols taught future Russians how to organize huge empire, because that's a very, I would say, tricky knowledge, how to organize such a vast space, the greatest space united ever in history. It was the space organized by Genghis Khan. Post system or mail system, couriers covering this. These are also words from Mongol language in Russian. Tamga, Diengi. There are many, I would say, civilizational influences that are connected with exactly, I would call it not despotic, but imperial heritage. Actually, Mongols united the space which Russia, future Russia, would use to revert centuries or rather millennia long history of organizing empires through the Eurasiatic steppe from the east to the west. Russia would be the first to revert that direction. Russia would organize for the first time Eurasiatic empire from the west to the east, only because it had prepared that way by Mongols.
Are there any other questions? Or
Please do anything connected with Russia or Poland.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was really a splendid class, in fact. And thank you very much for thank you for your response. Neutrality is not in the DNA of any people. The influence we have in this West, either not the Germans and then we have Mongol influence as well. But response that it was not in the DNA of any people, or the Aztecs against their neighboring countries. So what I would like to know is if you have any vision for the future. How will all this tendency from imperialism, or where are the exit to the conflict that we are currently living? I think it's very clear, and I really have a coincidence on the reasons or the deep reasons of the Russian leader. I think that you really nailed it. It's a very good explanation. But what's going to happen? I would really like to know your opinion about it.
Thank you so much for your kind words and for your question. I will start with admitting that even though I value very much history as important knowledge that helps us to understand our contemporary situation, I wouldn't dare to say that history is the key to the future. Future is always different than we imagine at a given time. And I know that whenever one tries to predict something for the future, it is always something different that comes. So that's a kind of caveat which I have to make for myself. But it seems to me pretty safe that in the short run, Russia may even prevail in that war. In a short run, this year, there could be even some successes, I believe, for Russian army. Maybe not, because Russia can lose miserably in the next few months as well. But I still can imagine Russian predominance on the front this year. However, what I am absolutely sure is that in the longer run, Russia would not be able to pursue effectively this imperial policy towards the West, unless it finds partners in the West. So only with the help of some Western power, Russia would be able to continue that particular imperial aggressive policy. Because without any help from any Western source, be it in Germany, France, or United States, even though United States in this particular moment seem to be at the very opposite side than Russia. But there are politicians in the States, and especially political analysts, influential lobbies, that try to denigrate the danger stemming from Russian aggression in Europe. So there is a slight possibility, I believe, but there is this possibility that Russia would find partners it strives so heavily to find in the West. Because the most important partners for Russia, still I would repeat my answer to the previous question by Dr. Swieczynski. That is, for Russia, the West still seems to be more important culturally in the Russian imagination, whether you like it or not. I think that's how most of Russian elite thinks. So they want to find a partner in the West. And if they find one, they will be able to continue with the imperial project. But it is now that the West is more or less united, it is a very dramatic situation for Russian imperialism. There is one more thing that should be stressed. For the first time during his 24 years almost long career as the leader of Russian power, Vladimir Putin is not succeeding because all previous military and political adventures he took were successful for him and for Russia. So why Russians should be angry at him? He delivered whatever he promised, he delivered. He delivered Crimea, he delivered humiliation of Georgia and territory of Southern Ossetia. He delivered humiliation of Poland in 2010. He delivered so many things to Russian imperialistic, I would say, audience. And for the first time, he did not deliver Kiev the last year. He promised he would deliver easily. This is something that makes his prospects less optimistic. That's why I think that even in this shorter run, I think I see more chances for Putin's defeat rather than for Putin's win. However, I accept the possibility that for a few years Putin can be still effective. More probably for me is his defeat. How quick, of course, I can predict.
A little bit following up to the previous question, because Putin can be replaced by someone in a similar way. So my question is, do you see any chances for Russia actually people will be somehow against this kind of policy?
Thank you very much for this very important question. I would say something almost heretical. I almost pray for Putin's health. Because the moment he would go, most of Western leaders would embrace anyone, would replace anyone. And this anyone would be as imperialistic as Putin is. I'm absolutely sure about it. And I'm not saying about his cronies from KGB, who are the most possible replacements for him, because only they have power to eliminate Putin. So people like him. I don't know about the names, but people from KGB. Of course, some of them might be more realistic, may retreat tactically, but in the longer run, they have exactly the same scenario in their heads. However, one can say, well, there is opposition in Russia. Alexei Navalny is the same. Yes, he is liberal in terms of economic policy, and he is, I would say, absolutely consciously against this bureaucracy, but he is absolutely and outspokenly as imperialistic as Putin is. He was first to back taking Crimea. He never said a word against the aggression in Ukraine. So he simply because he knows that he would lose most of his popularity, because that's how Russian nation is formatted now. That's the problem. Not just Putin, not just KGB, not just Navalny, but simply the fact that after many centuries of a specific culture that united despotic or autocratic, if you will, political system with culture that extolled that system. You could read poems of Pushkin, you could read Dostoevsky, those poems that are read at schools in Russia. This is not Yevgeny Onegin. This is To the Slanderers of Russia. This is Boris Godunov. You could listen to that opera, that great opera by Modest Mussorgsky. It is so extremely chauvinistic, anti-Western, imperialistic. Just listen to the words. Or Chowajszczyna, by the same great composer. I adore Russian opera. I love Mussorgsky, just like many other Russian composers. When you read, when you try to understand what they are conveying by their works, in most of cases, they are conveying the same culture that fits imperialism of Vladimir Putin. That's very unfortunate. Of course, not all Russians. There are other Russians like Lermontov, like Chekhov. But the mainstream of Russian culture is something like a resource for Putin and Putin-like leaders to continue that line. And to change that line, Russia would have to lose miserably. Not just lose tactically, but lose miserably. I don't wish anyone to lose miserably. But this is the only way to change Russia. Just as Germany lost miserably World War II, not World War I. But the moment when Germany was occupied by foreign countries and forced to change its political culture that gave democratic mandate to Hitler. And that culture was changed, but only under the external pressure. And frankly, I don't imagine any scenario when Russia is occupied now. So that's why my answer to your question is rather pessimistic. I don't see easy way or a quick way to change Russia, to make Russia different. And that's why, well, I pray, of course, this is only a bad job, I pray for Putin's help, because I'm afraid that there are many politicians in the West that want to retake the business as usual with Russia, and they want only the change of the face of Russia. Putin, after being officially acknowledged as the wanted criminal by the Hague Tribunal, is not very good person to renew business as usual. So there are very strong incentives in the way to find something like a pseudo alternative Russia. But for real alternative Russia, we have to wait longer.
Thank you, Adol. Thank you, Professor. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions, but I hope we will continue our discussion over a glass of wine and some snacks. So there was quite a pessimistic note in the end, but maybe some more optimistic will appear afterwards. So thank you very much.
But we drink something.
Thank you for your attention.